Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Narayanam Namaskritya Ram Narottam Devim Saraswatim Vyasam Tato Jayam Nashaprayu Bhadreshu Nityam Bhagavata Sripayam Bhagavati Uttam Shloke Bhaktir Bhavati Naishtiki. So continuing with the discussion on Srila Prabhupada Lilamrita by Satsuru Das Goswami, Volume 2, Planting the Seed, New York City, 1965 to 1966, Chapter 21, Beyond the Lower East Side. So last we studied, they were making the Sunday feast, and wonderful Sunday feast. As it is written before, there was halwa, dal, 2 sabjis, fancy rice, puri, samosa, sweet rice, apple chutney, and gulab jamuns or sweet balls. Kirtananda brought in the samosa filling, which he had prepared from spinach and green peas, cooked to a paste, and which Swamiji had heavily spiced. Stuffing the samosa was an art, and Swamiji showed them how to do it. He took a semicircle of dough, shaped it into a cone, stuffed it into a spoonful of filling, and then folded the top over and sealed it. A samosa ready for the hot ghee. So everything was made in ghee, not oil at that time. Achyutananda carried the imperfectly shaped puris into the kitchen, where he and Kirtananda deep fried them 2 at a time. If the temperature of the ghee, the consistency of the dough, and the size, shape, and thickness of the puris were all just right, the puris would cook in only a few seconds, rising to the surface of the ghee, where they would inflate like little balloons. The cooks then stood them on edge on a cardboard box to drain off the excess ghee. As they completed the last preparations for the feast, Swamiji's disciples washed the stiff dough from their hands and went down to the storefront, where they set out the straw mats and awaited the guests and the feast. Upstairs, Swamiji and a couple of his cooks offered all the preparations to Lord Chaitanya, reciting the Parampara prayer. The first few love feasts were not very well attended, but the devotees were so enthusiastic about the feast prasadam that they showed no disappointment over the scarcity of guests. They were prepared to eat everything. Satsuru. There was something called Brahman spaghetti, which was rice flour noodles cooked in ghee and soaked in sugar water. And there was halwa, pushpanna rice with fried cheese balls, samosas, split mung beans fried into crunchy pellets and mixed with salt and spices, puris, gulab jamun. And everything was succulent. That was the word Haigreve used. Yes, he would say, expressing it waggishly. Everything was very succulent, means full of juice. Eating the feast was an intense experience. We were supposed to be subduing our senses all week, following strict regulations, controlling the tongue. And the feast was a kind of reward. Swamiji and Krishna were giving us a taste of full spiritual ecstasy, even though we were still beginners and still in the material world. Before taking my plateful, I would pray, please let me remain in Krishna consciousness because it is so nice and I'm so fallen. Let me serve Swamiji and let me now enjoy this feast in transcendental bliss. And I would begin eating, going from one taste sensation to another, the good rice, the favorite vegetable, the bread, and saving the gulab jamun for last, thinking I can have seconds, and if I like, thirds. We would keep our eyes on the big parts, confident that there was as much as we wanted. It was a time of rededication. We all enjoyed with completely open relish and sense gratification. Eating was very important. Gradually, attendance picked up. The feasts were free and they were reputed to be delicious. Mostly local hippies came, but occasionally a higher class of experimenting New Yorkers or even the parents of one of the devotees would come. When the small temple was filled, guests would sit in the courtyard. They would take their prasadam, laden paper plates, and their wooden spoons into the backyard garden and sit beneath the fire escape or at the picnic table or anywhere. And after eating, they would go back into the storefront for more. Devotees were stationed behind the pots of prasadam, and the guests would come by for seconds. The other tenants were not very happy about seeing the courtyard full of festive guests, and the devotees tried to pacify them by bringing them plates of prasadam. Although Swamiji would not go down to the temple, he would take a plate in his room and hear with pleasure about the success of his new program. So that was definitely very, very successful program. One time the devotees were eating so ravenously that they threatened to eat everything available before the guests had all been served. And Kirtanananda had to admonish them for their selfish attitude. Gradually, they were understanding that the Sunday feast was not just for their fun and pleasure, but to bring people to Krishna consciousness. Prabhupada had begun Back to Godhead magazine in India. Although he had been writing articles since the 1930s, it was in 1944 in Calcutta that he had single-handedly begun the magazine in response to his spiritual master's request that he preach Krishna consciousness in English. It had been with great difficulty that through his pharmaceutical business, he had managed to gather the 400 rupees a month for printing. And he had single-handedly written, edited, published, financed, and distributed each issue. In those early years, Back to Godhead had been Prabhupada's major literary work and preaching mission. He had envisioned widespread distribution of the magazine, and he had thought of plans for spreading the message of Lord Chaitanya all over the world. He had drawn up a list of major countries and the number of copies of Back to Godhead he had wanted to send to each. He sought donations to finance this project, but help was scarce. Then in 1959, he had turned his energies toward writing and publishing the Srimad Bhagavatam. But now he wanted to revive Back to Godhead. And this time it won't be done single-handed. This time he would give the responsibility to his disciples. Means to his disciples who've been there just for a few months. And Prabhupada was ready to give them responsibility. Greg Sharp, now Gargamuni, since his recent initiation, found a press. A country club in Queens was trying to sell its small A.B. Dick press. Prabhupada was interested, and he rode out to Queens in a borrowed van with Gargamuni and Kirtananda to see the machine. It was old, but in good condition. The manager of the country club wanted $250 for it. Prabhupada looked over the machine carefully and talked with the manager, telling him of his spiritual mission. The manager mentioned a second-hand press he had on hand and explained that neither machine was actually of any use to him. So Prabhupada said he would pay $250 for both the machines. The country club did not really need them, and besides, the manager should help out, since Prabhupada had an important spiritual message to print for the benefit of humanity. The man agreed. Prabhupada had Gargamuni and Kirtananda load both machines into the van, and ISKCON had its printing press. So for $250, they got both the machines. Srila Prabhupada gave over the editorship of Back to Godhead magazine to Hagriv and Rai Ram. For so many years, he had taken Back to Godhead as his personal service to his spiritual master. But now he would let young men like Hagriv, the college English teacher, and Rai Ram, the professional writer, take up Back to Godhead magazine as a service to their spiritual master. In a short time, Hagriv and Rai Ram had compiled the first issue and were ready to print. It was an off night, no public kirtan and lecture, and Swamiji was up in his room working on his translation of Srimad Bhagavatam. Downstairs, the printing of the first issue had been going on for hours. Rai Ram had typed the stencils, and during the printing, he had stood nervously over the machine, examining the printing quality of each page, stroking his beard, and murmuring, Now it was time to collate and staple each magazine. The stencils had lasted for 100 copies, and 100 copies of each of the 28 pages, and the front and back covers were now lined up along two of the unvarnished benches Raphael had made that summer. A few devotees collated and stapled the magazines in an assembly line, walking along the stacks of paper, taking one page under another until they reached the end of the bench and gave the assembled stack of pages to God, who stood brushing his long hair out of his eyes, stapling each magazine with the stapler and staples Brahmanan had brought from his Board of Education office. Even Haigreve, who usually didn't volunteer for menial duties, was there, walking down the line, collating. Means, yes, whatever the pages have they printed, they stack them up and they have to pick up one by one and then staple them together. Suddenly the side door opened and to their surprise, they saw Swamiji looking at them. He opened the door wide and entered the room. He had never come down like this on an off night before. They felt an unexpected flush of emotion and love for him. And they dropped down on their knees, bowing their heads to the floor. No, no, he said, raising his hand to stop them, as some were still bowing and others already rising to the feet. Continue what you're doing. When they stood up and saw him standing with them, they weren't sure what to do. But obviously, he had come down to see them producing his Back to Godhead magazine. So they continued working silently and efficiently. Prabhupada walked down the row of pages, his hand and wrist extending gracefully from the folds of his shawl as he touched a stack of pages, and then a finished magazine. ISKCON Press, he said. Jagannath had designed the cover using a pen and ink drawing of Radha and Krishna, similar to his painting in the temple. It was a simple drawing set within a pattern of concentric circles. The first page opened with the same motto Prabhupada had used for years on his Back to Godhead. Godhead is light, nations is darkness. Where there is Godhead, there is no nations. And on the same page, Haigreve had not been able to resist giving a quotation from William Blake, approved by Swamiji, which substantiated the philosophy of Krishna consciousness. God appears and God is light to those poor souls who dwell in night, but does a human form display to those who dwell in realms of day. Although the editorial spoke of Blake, Whitman, and Jesus Christ as stress, it is to teach this science of devotion to God that Swami Bhaktivedanta has come to America. His message is simple, the chanting of the holy name of God, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare. Following the orders of his spiritual master, His Divine Grace, Shri Srimad Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Goswami Prabhupada Swami Bhaktivedanta began the initial publication of Back to Godhead in 1944. This bi-monthly, published from 1944 to 1956 in Vrindavan, India, established Swami Bhaktivedanta as a leading personalist in India. This issue marks the first publication of Back to Godhead in the West. The main article, a summary of a lecture given by Prabhupada, was based on notes taken by Umapati. It has been said that when we wake up and when we go to sleep, we should beat our mind 1,000 times with the shoe. When the mind says things like, why sing Hare Krishna? Why not take LSD? We should beat it with the same shoe. However, if we always think of Krishna, no beating will be necessary. The mind will be our best friend. And then there was an article by Haigreve, Flip Out and Stay. Haigreve had quoted liberally from Art Crane and Walt Whitman. No wonder so many young collegiates are trying to flip out permanently on super drugs. Perhaps this is their way of saying, we don't want any part of this hell you have made for yourselves. So they use psychedelics as a springboard to propel themselves into different realms. But the drug flip is only temporary. It is temporary because it's artificial. One really begins to wonder where all these trips are leading. Haigreve concluded that Krishna Kirtan is the quickest way to flip out without coming down. Your associates will think you are mad. That is the first sign of progress. Just let others be mad for Maya, the old ephemeral lures of women and gold, but you be mad instead for the reality. In the back of the magazine was an ad for Swamiji's essays, Krishna, the reservoir of pleasure and who is crazy, and a notice, soon to be printed, Gita Upanishad, or Bhagavad Gita as it is, translated and with commentaries by Swami Bhaktivedanta. So many things were going on. Prabhupada's first and main instruction to his editors had been that they should produce the magazine regularly, every month. Even if they didn't know how to sell the copies, or even if they only turned out 2 pages, they had to continue bearing the standard. He called Hayagriv to his room and presented him with a complete 3-volume set of his Srimad Bhagavatam. On the front page of each volume, he had written, to Shriman Hayagriv Das Brahmachari with my blessings, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami. Hayagriv was grateful and mentioned that he had not been able to afford them. That's all right, Prabhupada said. Now you compile this back to Godhead. Work sincerely and make it as big as Time magazine. Oh, wow. Prabhupada wanted all his disciples to take part in it. Don't be dull, he said. Write something. He wanted to give his disciples back to Godhead for their own preaching. Brahmananda and Gargamuni took the first issues out that same night on bicycles, riding to every head shop on the Lower East Side, all the way to 14th Street and as far west as the West Village, until they had distributed all 100 issues. This was an increase in the preaching. Now, all his students could take part in the work, typing, editing, writing, assembling, selling. It was his preaching, of course, but he wasn't alone anymore. See, Krishna is making all the arrangements. Now young blood, young devotees are there to help Prabhupada. Over a short 4 months, the society has expanded sufficiently to warrant large quarters in the small Second Avenue storefront temple. Stated the editorial in the second issue of Back to Godhead. Prabhupada had not abandoned his idea for a big building in New York City. Greenwich Village real estate was too expensive and Midtown was out of the question. But Prabhupada still said he wanted to buy a building. It was difficult for his followers to think of Krishna consciousness as anything more than a Lower East Side movement, because who but the people of the Lower East Side would be interested in Krishna consciousness? And anyway, who had money to buy a building in Manhattan? But one day, Ravindra Swarup had happened to meet someone, a wealthy Jewish heir, who was sympathetic toward young youth movements, who agreed to loan Swamiji $5,000. Ravindra Swarup had arranged the loan and Swamiji had designated the money as his building fund, to which he had gradually added another $5,000 that he had collected through incidental donations. But with suitable buildings started at $100,000, even this sum seemed petty. Swamiji went with Brahmananda to look at a building on 6th Street that had previously been the Jewish Providential Bank. It had a large lobby with mezzanine marble floors and the atmosphere of a temple. Brahmananda suggested that the vault area could be remodeled for use as a dormitory, and Swamiji considered the mezzanine for his own apartment. The large lobby, he said, could be used for kirtans and lectures. On leaving the building, however, Prabhupada noted that it was located on the corner by a bus stop, so it would not be a good location. The Gaudiya Math branch at Bagh Bazaar in Calcutta, he said, was also located at the bus stop, and the noisy engines of the buses, they started up, created a disturbance. Prabhupada next looked at the temple Emmanuel, also on 6th Street on the Lower East Side. It was even larger than the bank building, and when some of Swamiji's disciples walked through the cavernous, empty rooms, they became bewildered to think how, even if they could get such a place, they would be able to manage or use it. He visited other places, one so neglected and in such poor repair that it looked as though it had been vandalized, and another in similar condition, filled with lumber stacked almost to the ceiling. He asked Rupanuga, who had accompanied him, what he thought. And Rupanuga said, Too much time and money to fix it up. So they left. Swamiji returned to his room and went to the bathroom where he washed off his feet in the tub. He said, this was an Indian custom that after walking outside, you wash your feet. But now everybody is forgetting all these customs. Then devotees met Mr. Price, an elegantly dressed real estate agent. You have a handful of stars. Mr. Price told Brahmananda, you are incorporated as a tax-free religious organization. You have no idea how much money this will save. So many people have to vacate just because they can't pay their taxes. But someone up there is looking after you people, and you have just a place for you and your Swami. Mr. Price showed Brahmananda a handsome 3-story building near St. Mark's Place. It was a good downtown location near the young people, yet in an area where the uptown people would feel safe. The floors were polished hardwood. All the doors were ornately hand-carved, and it had a large hall suitable for a temple. Marquis de Lafayette had stayed here during his visit in 1824, a fact that added to the building's charm and prestige. One evening, Mr. Price visited Prabhupada up in his room. Prabhupada sitting on the floor behind his desk, and Mr. Price sitting on a metal folding chair. Mr. Price wore an elegant suit and a white dress shirt with cufflinks and starched cuffs. His expensive dress, meticulously tanned face, and blonde hair, which some devotees thought was a wig, contrasted strangely with the Swami's simplicity. Mr. Price kept referring to Swamiji as Your Excellency, and he expressed much appreciation of Swamiji's work. He spoke optimistically about how, through his connections, he hoped to save Prabhupada a lot of money and trouble and get him just the place he wanted. Accompanied by a few disciples, Prabhupada went with Mr. Price to see the building. While Mr. Price, the devotees, and the custodian of the house were all talking together in a group, Prabhupada wandered off unnoticed to a corner of the room where there was an old-fashioned sewing machine. He began pressing the treadle and examining the workings of the machine. As Prabhupada rejoined the group, Mr. Price said, if you can get just $5,000 down, I can get the owners to drop a contract. $5,000 down and another 5,000 within 2 months. That shouldn't be so difficult. Prabhupada liked the building and told Brahmananda they should purchase it. Brahmananda was inclined to turn the money over right away, but Prabhupada said that first a suitable contract had to be drawn up. Mr. Price talked to the devotees in private, speaking in Swami's interest and in the interest of spiritual movement. And he seemed to be promising them something even more than a contract. Perhaps he would give them the building. It didn't make sense that he could give the building, but he told them something like that. He wanted the devotees to think of him as a friend, and he invited them over to his house one evening. When the devotees gathered in his house, sitting stiffly on chairs in his living room, which was lined with bookcases filled not with books, but with 2-dimensional designs depicting rows of books, he continued to flatter them. He praised Haygreaves' writing, and Haygreaves was obviously embarrassed and flattered. He praised everything about the devotees. He also spoke of how his dog had recently died and said the house seems empty without the little fellow. He was an unusual man, effeminate and full of flattery and praises. Prabhupada remained reserved after his first meeting with Mr. Price, though he was interested in getting the building if the proper arrangement could be made. Brahmananda continued to negotiate with Mr. Price, and soon, according to Mr. Price, the owners of the building would be expecting the devotees to give proof of their ability to meet the payments. On Prabhupada's direction, the devotees hired a lawyer to go over the contract. This Mr. Price is causing us so much pain, Prabhupada said. What's the difficulty? He didn't see the necessity for Mr. Price at all. Why don't we purchase directly from the owners? Why all these agents? It's just the way it is done here, Brahmananda said. Well, anyway, there's something more to unfold here in this case. to just to let us know that we got to be careful when dealing with all these materialistic people. Got to be very careful. So anyway, I guess we can stop here and take up the rest tomorrow. See anybody has any questions or comments?
Thank you, Prabhuji. Nice class.
Thank you, Mata. Chalo,
Thank you,
you may
Prabhuji.
say wonderful day. Hare
Hare
Krishna. Jai Shri
Krishna.
Prabhupada.
Krishna.